So in our first section in Domain 2 for asset security, we're going to talk about data management, but specifically, how do we determine and maintain ownership? Data management includes the administrative and technical activities for handling data in your organization. Again, as we talk about this, it's important that you understand that we're talking about all forms of data. We're not just talking about, data on a hard drive or data that's being transmitted from one computer to another. We're talking about all forms of data. It could be employee records that are housed at the HR department. It could be medical records. It could be, physical files that are sitting in a file cabinet, and so on. So it's not just, the traditional technical data that we talk about being transmitted back and forth between computers. What are our long-term goals and what are our guiding principles for managing that data, right? What are the roles and responsibilities for each of the individuals that are responsible for that data? Who are the data providers? What are the roles and responsibilities for the data owners, as well as the data custodians? I'll kind of go through a scenario where we define how we recognize each of those roles a little bit later on, right? How do we define a data owner? How do we define a custodian, and so on? What are our data quality procedures, right? We want to make sure that we have assurances in place that the data is being handled with that CIA triad in mind, right? We want to be able to control the data at all stages. There is a life cycle to hardware, there's a life cycle to personnel, there's a life cycle to information assets that we have within our organization. How do we acquire the data? Make sure we follow those ethical guidelines and those standards for acquiring the data appropriately. How do we utilize that data throughout its life? And then finally, how do we dispose of that data in the end based on the requirements set forth by the data owner? We need to, of course, ensure that we have appropriate documentation of our data management practices. We have to have the appropriate metadata for each data set. Why is metadata particularly important when it comes to managing data sets? Because the metadata gives us information about that data set. It gives us the time it was created, the last time it was modified, could include things like checksums to verify the integrity of the data. It could include who the data owner is or who the data creator was. It could even include geolocation information for where that data was created, and so on. So metadata for data sets can be pretty important. Oftentimes we talk about, somebody submitting paperwork or submitting data for review, and that data had to be submitted at a specific time or by a specific time, or it had to include specific information. The metadata will show us that if we do actually have the appropriate metadata in place. Adherence to agreed data management practices. This can be either voluntary, right? Our data management practices can be just based on best standards or best practice standards, I should say, within the industry, but it can also be mandated by regulatory compliance requirements or even regulatory certification requirements. All right. We have to have planned and documented database specifications based on user requirements and the date that the data is being used. We'll talk about that in more detail a little bit later on. We need to have procedures for updates to our information systems, hardware, software, if we're changing file formatting or we're changing how the data is being utilized. How is the data being stored? What are the backup methods? Security doesn't only apply to data in motion or data in use. Security needs to apply to data at rest, data at storage, and so on. What are our archive principles? How do we securely store information? and so on. So again, it's the whole life cycle of that data itself. We have to, of course, be able to audit these processes. We need to be able to monitor these processes. If data retention is a requirement, which in most cases it is, right? Data has a lifetime beyond its use, oftentimes, for archival purposes or for storage purposes. So we have to have an appropriate archival plan that makes sure that not only are we worried about securing that data while it's being used, but also securing that data after it's been stored. There was I keep referencing kind of these TV shows. I am a little bit of a TV junkie, but on Mr. Robot, there was a scenario where they had they were trying to crash this bank, destroy the reputation of this particular bank or financial institution, and they didn't have any problem destroying the real-time information, the stuff that was being used today, but they had a real problem with figuring out how to destroy the archived information because the archived information was stored in a cold storage facility that was operated by a third party and was extremely secure. And so what they did is they found out how the data was archived, like specifically what type of media was being used for the archive, and it was a particular brand of tape. It was stored on tape media, right? Magnetic media. And so they found this particular brand of tape that this particular company used, and they got some of their own, and they started doing experiments on how that tape reacted to different environments, like from a temperature perspective and humidity perspective. And they found that after a certain temperature and certain level of humidity, the tape began to break down very quickly, and the data that was stored on that tape was no longer usable. So they broke into the HVAC system of this third-party cold storage facility and just started ramping up the temperature and the humidity in the room, and all the tapes were destroyed. So it was an interesting concept, but it's important to understand, right? The backup methods. And you know, when we talk about backup methods, we're not just talking about, are we using, magnetic media? Are we using a solid state media, whatever it might be, or even a cloud-based solution? But are those backup methods efficient or sufficient enough to be able to actually retrieve the data as needed, right? How are we classifying that data in its storage location? Is it indexable? Is it are we doing some sort of data deduplication to make the backups more efficient and so on? All types of considerations when it comes to backups. So we need to have an evolving data security approach of layered controls to reduce the risk within our data management concepts. Okay? What is a data policy? Just like any other policy, it defines the strategic goals, long-term and short-term goals of, in this particular case, data management across all aspects of a particular project or across the entire enterprise, whatever it's relevant to, right? If it's a global, kind of an enterprise-wide backup strategy, we'll have a policy in place to define that strategy. If it's just a backup policy or strategy for a particular project, we can have a separate policy for that, and so on. What are some of the things that we need to consider when establishing this policy? Cost, right? What is the cost of providing data versus the cost of providing access to the data? Now, what does that mean? The cost providing the data versus the cost of providing access to the data. When it comes to data, and obviously data can come in many, many different forms, there is a cost to acquiring the information, right? It could be a software program, and you have a software development team that is creating that program. And that would be, of course, the cost of creating the data or the cost of creating that information. We could be a sales organization where we're collecting information about prospective clients. So we're purchasing calling lists or we're acquiring calling lists from a third party. There is a cost of obtaining that data and providing that data. But then there's also the cost associated to be able to access the data. That would be, the databases that are housing the data or the applications that we're using to access the data and so on. All right. It's also important to establish ownership and custodianship. There are specific rights that are provided based on what your role is with that data. If you're the data owner, you have specific rights in place. You have the right to know how the data is being used. You have the right to know whether or not the data is accurate or not. You have a right to be able to rectify any inaccuracies within the data sets that are being collected. You have a right to say that the data is no longer allowed to be used and so on. As a custodian, you may not necessarily be the user of that data. You're certainly not the owner of the data, but you're responsible for protecting that data, right? So as a custodian, you may be the IT administrator that's responsible for the storage area network, or the IT administrator that's responsible for the data archives that are storing that data. That would be the custodianship. So we have specific rights that each kind of position has, whether you're the custodian or the data owner or the data user. We'll get into that a little bit more in detail later on. Privacy. We need to ensure that we classify what data is private, what data is not private. And there are multiple levels of classification as well. Okay? And remember, data doesn't have to be, like I said, traditional data on a computer or a hard drive. It can be intellectual property. It could be, creative works of art. It could be, trade secrets and so on. It's anything that's valuable to the organization that's informational, right? So there can be multiple levels of classification as well. Is it company confidential? Is it public knowledge? Is it need to know? Is it CXO level and above? Those kinds of things. What is the liability to the organization for using that data or even having access to that information? Right? We need to protect the organization from legal recourse, based on accidental destruction of the data, accidental exposure of the integrity of that data or the confidentiality of that information. So what are our liabilities, right? If you're given a top secret clearance by the federal government, most likely you're going to have access to secret information. And there's a responsibility that you have, having that clearance and having access to that information, there's a responsibility that you have to ensure that you're protecting that information. And there are legalities involved in that, right? You have very, very specific responsibilities. And if you fail to meet those responsibilities, you could be criminally prosecuted or at least civilly prosecuted, right? Is the data sensitive? Now, I kind of classify these together. Privacy and sensitivity kind of go hand in hand. Oftentimes we classify data in the public sector based on sensitivity to national security and sensitivity to secret operations, etc. What are the existing laws and what are our policy requirements? That's really important as well. There are right to privacy laws. There are, depending on the business sector that you're in, you have to protect in the healthcare industry, for example, you have to protect healthcare records and personally identifiable information and so on. And there are policy requirements. policy requirement may not be as, critical as a law, but policy requirements may be defined as I'm the data owner, and I'm willing to give you this data, but only if you follow these specific policies, right? Consider policy and process. Consider legal requests for data and policies. Make sure you have legal requests for data, and make sure you have policies in place for timely processing and response to those requests. So, you may be archiving or housing a bunch of information, and for the purpose of allowing individuals within your organization to gain access to that information, have a procedure in place, a formal procedure in place for requesting access to that information, and if they're given access to that information, to what extent do they have access to that information? Can they only view it when they're inside the enterprise? Do they have read-only access? Do they have read-write access, etc.? Okay. What are additional roles and responsibilities? You have to have objectives of data management roles and responsibilities. When it comes to information, right? There are very, very specific parameters to define what your roles and responsibilities are, right? Now, that might be defined with different terms, right? So you might be the SAN administrator, or you might be the network administrator responsible for backups. But that, by definition, would make you a data custodian. You might be in a hospital. You might be a doctor that is referencing medical records for a particular patient. In that case, you might be classified as a data user. But in any event, regardless of whatever interaction you have with that data and that information, we need to define what those roles are and what the responsibilities of those individuals are as they access that information, as they store that information, as they protect it, as they encrypt it, as they define the scope of use, whatever it might be, okay? So we need to understand who owns the data, and what is the accountability for that data. We want to make sure that we have accurate information, so data quality is important. Oftentimes when we're accessing this information, that information can be outdated, and it's a responsibility either of the data owner or at least the custodian to ensure that the data is accurate, that it's up to date, and so on. And again, the metadata metrics need to be maintained continuously. All right. Data ownership. Obviously, we talked about this already briefly. There is a life cycle to data, right? The data gets created, it gets used, and it gets destroyed eventually. All right. Now, how long that life cycle takes and what the scope of that life cycle is will depend on the type of data. But we need to make sure that the data is only available to those that require access to it. And if the data is no longer needed, we need to make sure that that data is either appropriately archived, both securely and with appropriate procedures, or it's appropriately destroyed. All right. What is the responsibility of the information owner? Well, certainly the responsibility of the information owner is to define how the data is going to be used, right? Who has the need for that information, and how should that information be released? We also have the responsibility to determine the impact the information has on the organization. Now, that is a little bit harder to define because you really have to, we've been talking about the context of data kind of obscurely. We're not really referencing a specific type of data, but these principles really kind of apply to all types of data. All right. But is the data relevant to the organization? Does it facilitate our objectives within the organization, and so on? What is the replacement cost of the information? Perhaps, you know, as a data owner, you're also the initial data provider. You know, maybe we need to define what the cost of replacing that data is so that we can understand what type of procedures or what type of functions we're going to put into place to make sure that that data is protected. Because we'll essentially apply principles of data management, knowing what the cost of replacing that data is, so that we can ensure that we are, you know, investing the appropriate amount of dollars to protect that data, as long as that dollar investment doesn't exceed the actual cost of the data. We also should know when the information is inaccurate, or when it's no longer needed, and when it should be destroyed. All right. There are a lot of other things that data ownership brings, though, right? As a data owner, you have really complete control over that data. How should that data be protected? What type of encryption should I apply for the data if it's being stored? You know, what is the general lifetime of that information? Which is kind of what we talked about in that last bullet point there. All right. We definitely need to ensure that we're identifying ownership. Is it intellectual property, and what intellectual property rights would apply? Is there a copyright implication? Is it, are there statutory or non-statutory obligations for compliance? What does that mean, by the way? Statutory or non-statutory obligations. It means that we are obligated by law or, you know, some sort of precedent, some sort of court ruling. You know, it's regulated by some entity, right? As opposed to non-statutory obligations, which might be just kind of personal preference or best practice standards or so on, you know, something that we would implement internally. Policies for data security, you know, how is the data going to be protected? How do we disclose the information? Not only, you know, how is the data transported and how is the data accessed, but what are the controls in place to ensure that only the individuals that are supposed to see that information and they only access it in a way that we deem appropriate, right? How do we release the data? Again, pricing. I guess pricing is mentioned multiple times because data does have value. I mean, why would you have it unless it has some sort of intrinsic value to the organization? So why would I be concerned about pricing for that data? I'd be concerned about pricing for the data because if that data is valued at X, $100,000, we'll call it. I have to have all of these policies in place. I have to have all these controls in place. My backup strategy, my archival strategy, my access strategy, all of these things that we're doing related to that data will have a cost as well. And if the value of the data is $100,000, but the cost of providing access to that data is $300,000, maybe the data is not as valuable, or maybe it's not. We maybe want to phase it out, or determine that it's just not feasible to maintain that data set, right? We have to have agreements on the condition of use. Condition of use is really defined by the data owner. Because you are the owner of the information, you get to determine how that data is supposed to be used. For example, if you sign up on Facebook or you sign up on Instagram, there's a kind of a terms and conditions checkbox that you have to check, which defines the condition of use for your personal information. You don't really have a right to privacy when you're on social media. And Facebook and Instagram, will state that, we have the right to utilize your information or use your information. So the condition of use is often considered as well. Licensure is important as well. Not only are we providing the kind of the condition of how you can use the data, but oftentimes that comes with a lifetime of use, right? Or a specific period of use that you're allowed to use that information. What is a data custodian? Data custodians are not necessarily the users of the data. They're certainly not the owner of the data. Well, I mean, I suppose they could be. The owner could be the custodian. But the custodian is the individual or group or team or whatever it might be that is responsible for enacting the policies that are defined by the owner, right? Archival policies, access control policies, confidentiality, integrity, and availability policies, whatever it might be. So as a data owner, you're going to ensure that the data sets are developed, they're maintained, and they're accessible within the specifications that the owner specified. The owner is the one that has the right to define how data is to be used. And this is what we refer to as data management. These are the individuals that are kind of enacting the management of that data. What are the responsibilities? Adherence to data ownership and data policy guidelines. In other words, whatever was defined by the data owner. Accessibility to users while maintaining security. So typically the custodian is the one that's providing the interface to access the data, and then also identifying how that access is granted, ensuring security, of course. The data set maintenance, including storage and archiving. Documentation, including updates, right? If we have various versions of data, we might want to have a versioning index that allows us to identify what version of the data sets are being stored or created and so on. Quality assurance as well, ensuring the integrity of the data. If there are additions to those data sets, if there are omissions from the data sets. But integrity is critical, right? We see this throughout the entire course, the CIA triad, right? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. You can see where data custodianship really falls within that category. A data owner might not be an individual that has the the wherewithal to apply technology, right? The data owner could just be the person that's providing the data, and the custodian is the one that is has the technical wherewithal and so on for implementing cryptography and whatnot. In data governance, that's what we're really talking about here, the whole concept of data governance. The responsibility for data management is divided between, different functions, right? And data custodian is one of those functions. So like I said, we have to make sure that access to the data is authorized and controlled. The data owners are identified for each data set. We have technical processes to sustain the data's integrity. We have a process that would exist for if we identify any kind of data quality issues. We have a process in place for data quality issue resolution. And that would be something that would be done in conjunction with the steward of the information or the owner of the information. We, of course, would be responsible for implementing the safeguards to protect the data. And we have different data models to manage that data. We'll talk about different data models as we go through the rest of the section here. All right. We definitely want to ensure that we have change management practices that are applied to the maintenance of the data as well. And that has to be auditable and verifiable through monitoring and so on. All right. You can understand why data quality would be important as well, right? Data quality is what allows us to define the integrity of the data, the confidentiality of the data, and so on. Oftentimes in IT-related forensic analysis, we have to ensure that we capture specific elements of data for that data to be admissible in a court of law or in a forensic investigation. All right. It's important to understand that data quality simply means that the data accurately represents whatever it's intended to represent. But you might have multiple data sources, so data consistency becomes important. Data quality can have lots of meaning, can have lots of different definitions, but the quality of information can be defined in many different ways. Right? Is the data fit for consumption? Does it meet or exceed the customer's expectation or the consumer's expectation? Does it satisfy the requirement for its intended use? Is the data accurate enough? Is it, if I'm using data sets to make decisions in policy, or I'm using data sets to make decisions within my enterprise, is that data accurate enough for that intended operational and decision-making process? Does it conform to the standards that were defined as part of the process of using that data? So it's really, that's what data quality represents. Does it have the characteristics, what we often refer to as the dimension of the data, the quality dimension of the data, to fulfill the requirements for use? Other things that might be characteristics for the dimension of data, if you will, are things like accessibility and availability, accuracy and correctness of the information, comprehensiveness of the data, coherency of the data, kind of clarity, flexibility for using that information. If it's time-sensitive information, what is the timeliness or the latency of the information? Is it reasonable information or is it valid information? All right. So data must be fit to use, and the quality defines the usability of the data, which includes data capture at the time of gathering, right? Data manipulation prior to digitization, identification of the collection and recording process, digitization and documentation of the data, storage and archiving, data presentation and dissemination, and data usage for analysis and manipulation, right? Now, how do we ensure quality? 99% of the time, we are going to ensure quality through the use of integrity mechanisms, right? Capturing hashes of data, doing, consistent data profiling to look for inconsistencies and other anomalies in the data. We can also implement quality control mechanisms for what we call data quality assurance, restricting inputs to the data, making sure that the data is precise, that it's accurate, and then implementing checks to ensure that the data meets conformity and consistency by using integrity checks and so on. Why is data quality, something that we talk about really kind of so much? It's because the data is there to be used. And if we can't ensure that the data is accurate, then its usefulness goes away, right? Final data quality and data fitness is based on accuracy, precision, resolution, reliability, repeatability, reproducibility, currency is an important one, we'll talk about that, relevance, auditability, completeness, and timeliness. Okay? Currency, right? Data has a value over its life cycle, particularly if it's related to intellectual property or technological design or something, piece of technology that's being developed over time. As data gets older, most likely that data is also becoming less and less valuable because it's being replaced by newer information. So let's hit these bullet points one more time. The data quality and data fitness is based on the accuracy of the data. I think that makes sense, right? Is the data accurate? If the data cannot be trusted because it has omissions or errors, then it's useless, right? Is the data precise? Precision is different than accuracy. Precision defines the detail of the data. If the data is not detailed enough, it may not be usable. It may not provide the information that we want it to provide. Is the resolution of the data? I don't know really kind of what they refer to here by data resolution. I guess that would be the detail as well. Certainly reliable. Reliability is a little bit different than accuracy. They can kind of be defined as the same thing. If data is not accurate, it's certainly not reliable. But reliability could also mean, can we trust that the data hasn't been modified? Can we trust that the data is still usable after the fact? Repeatability is important as well. Data set A being used at this point in time should be the same as data set A being used at a later point in time. Can the data be reproduced? I guess that would be in the event that data might be lost or might need to be copied or used multiple times by multiple parties. Is it relevant to what you're trying to do, right? That's important as well. I should only have access and only be using data that is relevant for whatever it is I'm doing, right? For example, if I'm a doctor and I'm assigned to a patient, I should only be able to see that patient's medical records. That doesn't mean that I should be able to see any patient's medical records, particularly if I'm a specialist and I'm only trying to treat that particular patient. Auditability makes sense. Auditability means the ability to verify all of these other things. Completeness makes sense as well. And timeliness. Over time, data becomes, like I said, less useful, or it can become less useful. When I access the data, I want to make sure that the data is accurate. Stock trading. If I'm doing stock trading or EFT trading, and I'm trying to get trading information, I don't want something that is an hour old. I can't make decisions in real time based on information that's an hour old.
Availability.
Sorry?
It's kind of availability too.
Yes, absolutely. Right? Availability, yes, I agree with that. But availability doesn't always suggest that something available could be something that you access in 400 milliseconds versus something you access in 10 milliseconds, right? So timeliness would kind of relate to that that need to have that information within a specific time period. But you're right, availability would affect timeliness without a doubt. What is quality control? The assessment of quality based on standards, processes, and procedures versus quality assurance. The assessment of quality based on standards external to the process to monitor quality control. So those are the definitions that I read, but really what is quality control versus quality assurance, right? Quality control is a process in which we review the quality of whatever it is that we're reviewing. For example, if it's a product that we're creating, what are the factors that allow us to identify the quality of that production, right? Versus quality assurance, which means that we have, if you will, specific checkboxes that we have to check to ensure that we have met the quality control guidelines, right? Quality control is the act of ensuring quality, and quality assurance is the verification that that we are making sure that we're not making mistakes in a manufacturing process. We're avoiding problems when we're delivering services, or in essence, we're providing confidence that all of our quality requirements will be filled. Quality control are those requirements, and quality assurance is that we have confidence that we're meeting those goals. These terms do often get kind of interchanged with each other, but the term assurance really means that that we understand that we're meeting our objectives, right? Whereas control is really used to describe kind of the overall process to achieve quality assurance, right? How do we define the steps? How do we measure them? How do we analyze them? How do we improve on our process, and so on? All right. Quality assurance basically is the administrative or procedural activities that we implement within our quality system so that the requirements that we outline, the goals that we have production to produce a product and service will be fulfilled. Now, we mentioned this specifically with data because data does need to have quality, right? And we need to have that quality control and quality assurance, right? Two kind of quality assurance principles. Is it fit for purpose, right? And that would definitely apply to data. We've mentioned that a couple of times already. And is it right the first time? That definitely applies to data, right? So we can apply those principles to manufacturing as well, or software development, or many other aspects of our daily administrative lives. But in this case, these apply to data management. All right. Data documentation and organization. It is critical for ensuring data sets are usable and ensures their longevity, right? Data often, all aspects of the data definitely would need to be documented. We would have very, very detailed documentation on how to achieve all of the things that we talked about with data. How do we acquire the data? How do we store the data? How do we use the data? How do we access the data? And so on. What are some of the objectives of documentation? We want to make sure that the data maintains its lifetime for either a single use or different purposes. We want to make sure that the data users understand the content, context, and limitations. Not only data users, but we can also define the roles and responsibilities of the custodian, or even what the objectives are of the owner. Facilitate discovery of data sets. So by organizing our data sets, we're going to know what kind of data we have. And facilitate the interoperability of data sets and data exchange. Okay? All right.